Hello, welcome to LifeWork, a podcast devoted to the working man and the working woman. We want to equip our listeners to live out their faith in the places where they work. My name is Stan Norman, and my co-host is Rhyne Putman. Thank you for joining us. Let's jump into today's podcast. Well, hello, Rhyne. How are you today?
I'm Peachy Keen. Dr. Norman, how are you?
I don't know if I can rise to the occasion of Peachy Keen. What exactly does that mean? You're from Georgia?
I am definitely not from Georgia. I've never had a Georgia state of mind in my whole life.
Wow.
So, yeah.
Wow. I don't even know how to respond to that. What kind of state of mind have you had? Or what's your state of mind today? We'll go with that.
I mean, it's a little bit of Robitussin and a little bit of tired of the cold weather. You know,
chemically
that kind of
enhanced state of mind. Well, we've been talking about this thing of calling as we move into the new year, and doing a little bit of a pivot at this point. And I think it may be a divine pivot in that I heard a message that you brought today in chapel, and it just seemed to speak very pointedly to this topic of calling. And as you were preaching, I was thinking, okay, there's a lot of primary calling teaching going on here, but there's also some secondary calling going on as well. That is calling to do something on behalf of God.
Yeah.
So first of all, what was the topic you addressed today?
Well, maybe we should back up and just define what you just said, because I think that's a helpful distinction. That primary calling is a call to be in a relationship with God through Christ. That God calls all people unto himself. And that kind of secondary calling, maybe what we sense is a call to vocation of some kind, is God calling you to do something specific. And the Bible is full of those sorts of callings where God, calls, Jeremiah to be a prophet. God calls, Paul on the road to Damascus to be an apostle to the Gentiles.
The Lord called the first 12 apostles.
And again, there are several instances where they came to salvation the moment they were called to a particular job or a particular task. I think for a lot of us in today's world, probably most Christians, it's just the opposite. It's that we feel a call or a sense that we need to obey God and become believers, follow Jesus, and then somewhere a little bit later down the road, we feel like God is moving us towards a particular task, a particular job. We start to connect the dots between our lives and what God wants to do through our jobs or through our work in the world. And so that's typically the way that God works among Christians today. In the case of the passage that I dealt with today, it was from Judges chapter 6. It was like most of the book of Judges, Israel was in a state of chaos. In this particular instance, Israel's sin had led to God basically handing them over to the Midianites. The Midianites, I like to say, they were kind of like agricultural terrorists or ecological terrorists. They were burning down the fields of Israel. They were stealing the crops, the cattle. They were basically, kind of committing warfare by starving Israel to death. And so Israel went into hiding. And we meet Gideon in the middle of this situation. He is trying to thresh wheat from behind a wine press. Like he's literally in hiding when God finds him. God knew where he was the whole time. Yeah. But I mean, when the angel of the Lord encounters him, he's there kind of in his darkest and weakest moment.
So let's stop there and think in terms, okay, where Gideon is in life, God still found him.
Right.
And God still called him there.
Right.
I think it's pretty significant for a lot of people that are listening that you're not on the mountaintop. You're not living life large. You're not having everything go your way.
Right.
In fact, it's just the opposite. Externally, internally, and God still came to him and called him.
He meets us in our weakest moments and our darkest places, and that's really sometimes the place where he speaks the loudest to us. And that was clearly the case here in this encounter. We don't all have an encounter. At least I personally haven't. Maybe you have, Dr. Norman, with an angel of the Lord coming and speaking to me.
No, I have not.
That's not been my experience, but I do know that God has spoken to me in those moments when I was hurting the most, or when I felt like I was at my wit's end. Sometimes those are the moments when God speaks to us.
And you know what's really shocking is that often, though not always, but often, those encounters and calling moments are not just callings of comfort, although that can be part of it. They're callings of challenge, callings of encounter, that God being aware of the circumstances and the situation you're in. Okay, yeah, you're there. You're at a good place. Now I'm going to come with a calling for a relationship and a calling of responsibility.
Sure. And what Israel had called out to God for, they'd asked God for another deliverer. They'd ask him for a judge. And it might be that somewhere along the way, the text doesn't tell us this, but it might be that Gideon was among those people who called for a judge. He might have been one of those people calling out for a deliverer, but he certainly never saw that in himself.
Send somebody else.
Send somebody
Raise
else.
up somebody else.
Raise somebody up for the task, just not me, Lord. And so when the angel of the Lord speaks to him in verse 12, it's actually kind of humorous. The angel of the Lord appeared to him and said, "The Lord is with you, valiant warrior." Mm-hmm. I mean, there's no small dose of irony in the way that he calls him a brave warrior. And here's a guy who's literally doing crops behind a wine press because he's trying to hide from the enemy. Who are you speaking to, Lord? I mean, who are you talking about? I mean, again, it would be like, the angel of the Lord telling me that I was going to be the starting center for the New York Knicks. I'm not really qualified or prepared to do that.
Hope. I want to see this come down.
But what's remarkable is I think the Lord sees in us what we don't see in ourselves.
Yeah.
At least he knows what he can do through us, even when we don't know what he can do through us. He knows the strength that he can give us to do what a coward like Gideon was able to do. And you read all across, Gideon's story, particularly, into the end of chapter 6 and then later in chapter 7 with the sign of the fleece and everything. Gideon was always lacking in confidence. He wasn't the most secure guy. I mean, he was always asking for signs and always asking, are you sure about this, God? Are you sure this is? Can you give me just a few more signs? I just need a little bit more evidence that this is what you're doing. But God knew what he was up to in his life. And God was moving in Gideon's life before he called him. And God, works through the circumstances of our lives. Acts 17, Paul tells us that the moment and time and place in history that we come into, the family that we're born into, that's all God's great plan. That's God's sovereignty at work, because he wants to see if we can reach out, move, that we might find him, that we might be in a relationship with him. And that's exactly what was going on in Gideon's life. Gideon was being prepared for that moment, even if he didn't realize it yet, what God was going to do in his life.
So you have the primary calling,
right,
and a secondary calling, both coming simultaneously.
Yeah, and I get the impression from the text that Gideon really didn't have much of a relationship with God beforehand, because there's this comment that he makes, if the Lord is with us, why has all this happened? Again, talking about the Midianites.
Certainly a lot of bitterness there.
And he says, and where are all his wonders that our ancestors told us about? Hasn't the Lord brought us out of Egypt, but now he's abandoned us and handed us over to Midian? I mean, it's like I've heard all these stories all my life in Sunday school. I know about what God did to the Egyptians. I know about the plagues. I know about God leading the Israelites through the Red Sea, and we know about all that happened in the wilderness. But that God, if he's still there, he's abandoned us. And I mean, it's like he knows it on an intellectual level, maybe, but he doesn't really know it on the level of his heart. And so, I mean, when God speaks to him and God makes this initial calling, you can tell that there's a broken relationship there. And so, I mean, essentially what's going to happen, and it shows up a little bit later in this chapter, that he has to repent. He has to come into a relationship with God, kind of a saving knowledge of God, so that he can fulfill this particular vocational calling that God's placed on his life to be Israel's deliverer.
So just kind of trying to summarize maybe some thoughts here. One, the primary calling of a God often finds us at the lowest moments or the weakest moments of our life.
Yeah.
That's where he found Gideon. And that primary calling of God has a comforting, challenging component to it.
Sure.
That he calls Gideon out, but he also is calling Gideon to go out.
Come all who are weary.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the calling that Jesus gives us. I mean, it could have been just the same kind of calling given to Gideon, because Gideon was clearly weary. He reaches him where he's at. He gives him words of assurance, even though Gideon's pushing back, and he's got complaints about God. He's got complaints about himself. I mean, he goes on and he says, "How can I deliver Israel? My family is the weakest in Manasseh, and I'm the youngest of my family. I'm the runt of the litter."
He said, "I'm the lowest man on the totem pole in the whole area."
Yeah, like there's nobody who's less qualified for this than I am. But God says, "I will be with you," and He says, "Go in the strength that you have." I think that's an interesting statement, because it's a statement about what God does in our lives to equip us to accomplish the call that He's placed on our lives. Go in the strength that you have. You have it. You might not know you have it yet, but go in it.
Is it fair to say that God's calling gives us a better assessment of who we are than our own self-reflection?
Absolutely. God knows us better than we know ourselves. And I think that's one of the things that hinders us from obedience so much, is we just don't think we have what it takes to either, kind of quit the sin that we love, or do the difficult thing that God has tasked us with. Maybe that's sharing our faith with a family member or a neighbor or a coworker. But God knows exactly what He can do through us if we're just willing and just open ourselves up to be used by Him.
So you got a guy that's, if he has faith, he's weary in it. If he doesn't, he is about to embrace faith in the living Lord. And God calls him to Himself, and God calls him to a task. It's a pretty Herculean task, especially considering Gideon, who he actually physically was, and all the realities of his actual life, circumstantial parts of his life.
And he goes on and he does some hard things. I mean, and it starts really at home. I mean, that's a remarkable thing. Before Gideon, goes and does this mammoth thing, and it is fighting the Midianites, he has to tear down the family Baal idol, and that
sin has crept into the camp.
I mean, there's a lot going on at home that has to be dealt with first before he can go and complete the bigger task that God's put before him. And so it's like that general call. He has to address that first, and then he can go and fulfill that larger purpose that lies ahead of him, and how God is going to use him to be a deliverer.
I think this is a great illustration of how the primary calling shapes the secondary calling.
Yeah.
And that secondary calling can only occur rightly, appropriately, meaningfully, when that primary calling is first embraced, and we walk with God in that.
Right.
That's good stuff.
It is good stuff.
It's good stuff. Hope our listeners find it helpful too. Thank you.
Thank you.